Welcome back to the channel. I'm Reed, and this is, let's call it part 3.5 of the Man Cave Guitar Pedal Mania special episodes on building a guitar sourced almost entirely from parts bought from Guitarfetish.com. In the last episode, I took a torch, charred this body, went over it with steel wool, and then applied some tung oil. Following the directions on the tung oil bottle, I let it set up for an hour and then wiped off the excess. And sadly, the body never stopped being tacky to the touch. There's still a film of oil on it, so I looked up some other videos online, and according to my favorite YouTube luthier, Crimson Guitars, you should wipe off your oil finish within 5 to 10 minutes. Otherwise, as he says, it never really sets up and it's always going to be tacky. Well, that's exactly the experience that I've had. So at this point, I am going to sand back the body. I've already started this process. It's actually kind of disappointing because I really like every stage of the color revealed. I liked that dark chocolate color. Here it is, kind of very loosely sanded. And I like that as well. You'll notice I haven't done the edges yet. I really like doing bodies with edges of contrasting color. If you have a body that's all one color, you can really lose the visual shape of it. In fact, that's one thing that binding does, is give your eye something to latch onto when you're looking at a guitar. Otherwise, it can just be kind of this overwhelming blob of color. Sadly, that's all got to go. So I'm going to continue sanding this down. And by the way, oil and soot gunks up sandpaper like you would not believe. So again, this is all a learning process. That's one of the reasons I do new things every time I build a guitar. I love the learning process. Even though sometimes the learning process is a lot of work. So I'm going to finish sanding this down. That'll probably take a couple of hours. And then I'm going to retorch it. And because this thing is impregnated with tung oil, when I apply the blowtorch to it, the whole thing may go up in smoke. And my camera assistant is not available, so I'm sorry I don't have the ability to show you all of that. After I torch it, I will bring it back in and remove the soot with a wire brush. I'll probably try and film that. Or maybe I won't. It's redundant from what I've already shown. I may do it and just super fast forward through it. We'll see how the spirit is moving me when I get to that part. So, mistakes were made. We're going to see if we can fix them. And then we're going to move on to the hardware, which is where, it really stops looking like a piece of wood and starts looking like an electric guitar. And I'm back. So I took the body out and retorched it. I really do wish I could have shared that with you. It was kind of fascinating, as I suspected it would. As I ran the heat over it, that tung oil came to the surface and I would wipe it off. Really kind of fascinating stuff. The other thing that I found really, really interesting is if you can see these little spots here, as I applied the heat, I don't know if it's water inside the wood or what, but they would come up to the surface. I would torch them down until they burst, I guess. So this has been retorched, gone over with a wire brush, little steel wool for the parts that I couldn't reach with the wire brush. So you can see it's a lot less sooty than I had in my previous attempt. The edges are still darker. So I think we're going to call this a soot burst. A burnt burst? There's an idea. The next step, it's really, really humid out here today, so I'm going to let this set up in my nice conditioned shop. That should give it a chance to dry overnight. Tomorrow I will come out and apply oil to it. And since I was watching the Crimson Guitars video on how to do a burnt finish. I actually have some Crimson Guitars guitar finishing oil that I'll use instead of just the regular tongue oil. And hopefully that'll get us a nice hard finish so that I can handle this thing without getting soot on my clothes. Because let's face it, that is the point. If you can't handle it without getting soot all over yourself, then the burnt finish is completely pointless. However, I think it's looking very unique and attractive. So we will come back in the morning and pick it up from there. Okay, it's later in the afternoon. It's experimentation time again. Decided that rather than doing an oil finish this time, I'm going to use wipe-on poly. Just good old Minwax wipe-on poly. Now, wipe-on poly is not the same as catalyzed polyurethane paint, but it does produce, I think, perhaps a better seal than oil. The question is, with this wood already oily and sooty, if the poly will bond to it. That's the experiment. If it does, I think it'll produce a nicer finish. So to prepare it for the poly, we just give it a little bit of roughing up. This is 220 grit paper. Around the edges. So you can see I'm not being super fastidious about sanding it here. This isn't about getting it smooth. What is very important, though, is making sure that we get all of the dust off. Also, when you're sanding, unless you're using a random orbital sander, always go with the grain. It is very hard to find truly lint-free items, but you really do not want lint getting into your poly. Lint, or dust, or oil, or anything else. It would be better if I had a painter's tack cloth, but I do not. All right. So wipe-on poly is exactly as the name says. Just put a little on a rag. Oops. Let me grab a glove. Now, let's start this again. Just put a little on a rag and you wipe it on. The key is very, very thin coats. Remember, you're just sealing the wood. You're not doing like a clear coat where you're putting a hard candy shell around the outside. So nice and thin. It's really not any deeper than an oil coat. You can see the shiny part there. That's where I've wiped it on. And there is a little soot coming off still, which is worrying, but I'm hoping that once we get some poly on this, that'll seal that off, and the wood will no longer, the soot will no longer be an issue. This one's not like an oil coat where you have to come back and remove the excess later, because there shouldn't be any excess. If there is, you've just applied too much poly. Should lay down nice and flat. So, try so hard to make this lint free. You do go over it with sandpaper between coats, so it's not the end of the world if you get a little bit of lint in it, because you'll sand it out later, but it is better to not have lint in it in the first place. Really just judgment as to how much you put on at one time. It is kind of like an oil finish, and that you just want it to look a little wet. Minimum buildup. So I'm going to finish off the back of this and then let it dry. As you can see, that burnt wood looks really spectacular. I'm really liking the way this turns out, so I hope that this poly will seal off the burning so that we don't get any more soot. May take a few coats, but that's okay. Doing guitar projects is all about patience. It's something I've always struggled with, but if you're not patient, you end up with a bad result. All right. The process at this point is just wipe on the poly, let it dry for 2 or 3 hours, sand it back with 220 grit, wipe on more poly, and repeat until you get the finish that you want. And the finish I want is to be able to run one of these rags over it and not pick up any soot. So I'm not sure how long that's going to take. It may take a couple of days. And there's no need to film all of that. So I'll just get back and do a wrap up when this poly finish is completely done. Okay, it's been an eventful couple of days. I think when last I was here, we retorched the body, sanded it down, tried to put some wipe-on poly on it, and that just wasn't getting the body, which was still full of that tung oil, it just wasn't getting it sealed off. So I went to one of my secret weapons, ordinary spray paint. This is just Krylon Fusion all-in-one paint and primer. It's clear. Now, this would not work for a solid guitar finish particularly well, but for this type of finish where the grain is all part of it, it works just fine. And look at the result of that. There's that spot on the back of the neck pocket where that weird piece of wood just would not be burnt. So look at the color on that. That is amazing. So I'm really actually very happy with the way that turned out. Let me take a second and talk about guitar paint. This is something that people fight about on the internet all the time because that is the nature of the internet. People just fight about things for whatever reason. There are 2 primary paint systems that have been used to paint electric guitars since there have been electric guitars. Something called nitrocellulose lacquer, and the modern thing is polyurethane. So here's the thing. Neither of those paint systems were developed for guitars. They are not guitar paint. They're car paint. In the 1950s, when Leo Fender started painting the Telecaster and the Stratocaster, he painted those guitars with the paint that was available to him. They didn't invent new paint for that. He just went out and he bought off-the-shelf paint, which at the time happened to be DuPont nitrocellulose lacquer. It was car paint. The colors of the 1950s Stratocasters and early 60s Stratocasters, those are Cadillac colors. Fiesta red, Sonic blue, seafoam green. You could get your Cadillac in those colors, which meant that there was a lot of that paint around. He didn't use it because of its sonic properties. He just used paint. Nitrocellulose lacquer is rather unusual in that it shrinks. It never stops shrinking. So that's why you get old guitars that the paint on it is kind of checkered or cracked, because nitrocellulose lacquer is always releasing, as they say, VOCs, volatile organic chemicals or compounds. I'll have to look that up. But the paint continues to shrink, always. And it takes 30 days to reach maximum hardness. So that really slows down your production time. Now, you can sand it before that, but it means that you really have to let it cure for 30 days. If you get a guitar that has a nitrocellulose lacquer on it and you can smell, sometimes people say it smells kind of like pineapple, that means it's not through curing. And that paint is still softer than it will be after a while. Also, you can't spray nitrocellulose over anything because it will continue to shrink and it will crack whatever is underneath it. Now, polyurethane, sometimes known as catalyzed polyurethane, is literally plastic. It comes in two pieces, the catalyst and the color. You mix them together and they harden into plastic. It's fast, it's not instantaneous, but it's really, really fast compared to nitrocellulose. It's much more durable, and you can polish it to a super high gloss. I love polyurethane. It's much easier to work with than nitrocellulose. Now, because the guitar economy is driven primarily by nostalgia, people will say over and over again how much better nitrocellulose sounds. Again, I think that's bunk. Now, is there a sonic difference between nitrocellulose and polyurethane? There may be. Polyurethane is harder than nitrocellulose. Don't believe what you read. Wood does not breathe. I've seen that on a lot of advertisements for guitars finished in nitro. Have a nice thin coating to let the wood breathe. Dead wood does not breathe. It is 100% inert. All that happens is moisture moves in and out of it. And that's what you want to seal off with your paint job. Now, it looks different and it feels different, and people can like the look or feel of whatever they want. But in terms of the sonic differences, you know, I love Anderton's TV, and they did a video where Rob Chapman, who has, you know, really good ears, listened to a nitro guitar and a poly guitar and said, oh, well, there's a difference in the 2000 range or the 2K range on the equalizer. Well, maybe there is. So what? One, that difference is tiny enough that the vast majority of people won't hear it. And if it bothers you, see, you've got these things called tone controls on the front of your amplifier. So if your 2000 is too high, that's a mid-range, just turn down the mid-range a little bit. Or if it's too low, you turn up the mid-range. To me, just like wood, the paint makes no difference. Does affect how it looks, absolutely does. But how it sounds, get real. So, in this case, I'm able to use just simple store, buy at your local hardware store spray-on paint, because I'm not worried about getting a perfectly flat finish. That's what you want with either the nitrocellulose or the polyurethane. You want a flat finish. The point with those colored finishes is to hide the grain. And you do that if you've got multi-piece bodies. But I think this thing looks great as is. Now, it's clearly still gassing off a little bit. I actually still get a little bit of a burnt smell from it. And that means that there are still compounds coming out of the paint and taking some of that soot with them. The most important thing is that it's not going to get soot on you. So here is a relatively clean cloth. Okay, still clean. That means that you can handle it. You can hold it against your clothes and you're not going to get soot on you, and that's the important part. Also, I think this looks phenomenal. So we're going to call this finish done. I am not displeased with that now. This body has been through so much, it is practically indestructible at this point. So you can see I've got cracks in the end from where I applied the heat, and it caused the wood to shrink up as the moisture left it. It's all good. It's all good. So the next step is going to be starting to put hardware on it. That's when it really starts to look like an electric guitar. So that'll be video 5 or video 4 if I call this one 3.5. I haven't decided yet. So I'll see you very, very soon. I'm Reed. This is Man Cave Guitar Pedal Mania, special edition, building a guitar, almost entirely out of parts bought from Guitarfetish.com.